And with no further ado, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee brings to you the presentation of Fostering Resiliency with Ms. Adrienne Redeau. Go ahead, Ms. Redeau. Thank you.
All right. All right, everybody. Well, thanks for coming and showing up. First, today is a day that we need to talk about resiliency. If there's any day to talk about resiliency, I would say that today is the day. And so when I was asked to do this, I had a plan and an agenda that I usually do, and then the world happened and snow happened in Portland. And I always tell people that we don't adapt well to snow in Portland. So I changed things up a little bit to really honor what people are experiencing today. And my hope is through this time, I can give you some tangible skills that you can leave with, that you can start practicing today. Some things that you could do maybe tonight if you're feeling stressed out throughout the week. But my hope is to give you actual tangible skills that you can leave with. Talking about mental health can be stressful and overwhelming because we kind of create a lot of insight and awareness, but I also want this to be tolerable and fun, and maybe we could laugh one time today. So before we jump in, I just wanted to give you all that information that if you need to listen to me as you're doing dishes or doing other work, that's totally fine. But I'm hoping we can jump in and give you some skills. So fostering resiliency. What we'll do today is we'll go through kind of each of them, and I'll give you some information, and then I'll give you a skill attached to it. So before we even talk about building resiliency, we need to understand why resiliency is needed. You all have a unique experience working in the judicial system, and some would say that that experience is encompassing of many unwanted experiences, traumatic experiences, and today what we're going to talk about is how you honor those for you. 2020 was not an easy year for anybody, especially those of y'all who are working in the judicial system. Those who are trying to honor rules and laws while also honoring people and individualism and our collective consciousness. And so what I want to talk about today, before we even get into how to make resiliency from what you already have, I want to talk about why resiliency is needed. So oftentimes when I do this talk, the first thing people say when we're in person is, well, I am resilient. I have a lot of resiliency. I've made it here. I have this job. I have a family. I have a career. I've been through many unwanted experiences or traumatic experiences. And I do believe that we all have built-in resiliency, things that we learn generationally, things that are passed down to us, skills that we just have to create in the moment. But I want to talk about the resiliency that people have needed for the traumas that they've experienced in 2020 and now going into 2021. And one of the words that's a big trigger buzzword these days is trauma, right? It's a big word and everybody's using it. So one of the things we're going to talk about is trauma. And in the mental health field, there are many different definitions of trauma. This is one that I find very helpful, and it says, an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physical or emotional harm or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on an individual functioning in their mental health, physical health, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. So what it's outlining is that if there's any circumstance where you have felt physically or emotionally harmed, or been in a situation that is life-threatening, we would determine that as a trauma. So I also like to explain to clients that trauma is something that is an unwanted experience that you might have not had control over experiencing. And so trauma could be anything from an acute trauma, which is a car accident, you're a survivor of sexual assault, to vicarious trauma for y'all who work in the judicial system, which could be hearing people's stories of harm, hearing people's stories of physical or emotional abuse. There is a part where with vicarious trauma, sometimes what happens next is I've experienced this with maybe my colleagues, or I've experienced this with a client that I'm working with, and then I have my own acute trauma. Could be a loss of a family member, it could be a loss of a job, again, a car accident, or somebody says something where you feel like you were emotionally harmed. So this could be a microaggression, a macroaggression, somebody saying a racial slur. Those are all experiences of trauma. And when you compile them all, which oftentimes people who work in the judicial system have a multitude of many of them, then what we get into is what we call complex trauma. And so if we look at your experiences, and a part of this is talking to simply just the judicial system, we have things like COVID-19, which impacted our physical safety, right? So harm of going outside, getting sick, a family member getting sick. We also have physical safety that was triggered when we look at the protesters who are outside the courthouse. If you were at the courthouse, if you were protesting yourself, right? So there is a worry of harm and safety there. As well as for those who are within the BIPOC community, we also want to layer on, right, that there's experience of vicarious trauma through either police brutality that's experiencing somebody else. So when we saw the murder of George Floyd, right, that is vicarious trauma because we watched somebody die. And when you do that, you hold on to that and it holds in your body. It may not hold in your mind or in your spirit, but your body holds that. And so we layer those, right? We have COVID-19, we have protesters, maybe you were a protester or you were at the courthouse, and then we add the increase of police brutality that we are seeing, maybe not experiencing, but seeing. We have three things within the judicial system that you all have collectively experienced that really challenge your physical safety. And again, trauma says physical or emotional safety. So the next part that we layer on to the physical safety is you're being emotionally harmed, right? We all have experienced emotional hardship, but being emotionally harmed and emotional hardship are two different things. We are all going to experience emotional hardship. I experienced that today getting out of my driveway and trying to make it to my office. But there's a difference when I'm feeling emotionally harmed. And what we want to be mindful for those who are in the judicial system right now, like you all are, sometimes that emotional harm can be things like personal attacks, right? So family attacking you, friends attacking you, being outside of the courthouse. We also have the emotional harm, which sometimes can be triggered by uncertainty, right? Do I still have a job? Is my family safe? Am I safe? Can I leave the house? And then we're going to add all of that experience of trauma, which is COVID, protesters, police brutality through vicarious trauma or personal trauma. And then we're going to add on the chronic stress of being a worker in the judicial system. So when we add all of those things on to one another, what we get for some people, their experience is it's complex trauma, right? So I not only have an event that is traumatic for me, but I'm experiencing vicarious trauma because I've seen something on social media that was really harmful to me. I could also be experiencing indirect trauma. So that means that maybe I live in an environment or a place that isn't safe. So while we are experiencing all these different things that 2020 allowed for us, the hard part that we find is that the resiliency that I have for daily life didn't prepare me for 2020. So before we talk about resiliency, I want to honor for all of you that these can be a culmination of a lot of unwanted experiences, daily and chronic stress that you have, exposure to emotional lack of safety, as well as physical safety because of COVID. And then we have to look at, if I'm experiencing all those things, what do I need to do to support myself? And so for some of my clients, they show up to my office and they say, I don't really know what's going on, but a friend says I need to talk to somebody, or my partner says I need to talk to somebody. And oftentimes what we find is that there are a lot of experiences of trauma that, because of how our culture understands trauma, they aren't really honored. And being in therapy or being in a community group can allow you to honor your own experiences. The next part we're going to talk about is some of those mental health symptoms that come from the experience of trauma. So we could, again, acute trauma is a one-time event. Indirect trauma, maybe you're from a war-torn country or a disenfranchised neighborhood. Vicarious trauma being within the judicial system. So seeing people's hardships, hearing their stories of trauma, or what we could also look at, we talked about, which is experiencing vicarious trauma through things like social media and the news. And so some of the really common symptoms that I ask all people to look out for. So this is if you don't have a therapist, you do have a therapist, you've never thought about your mental health, or you're somebody who's really invested in it. One of the first symptoms that people have is disturbed sleep and fatigue. And so this isn't the normal tired, right? We're all tired because of COVID and life and commuting and now snow, and some people don't have power. So this is not just exhausted, this is fatigued. Like I can't catch up on my sleep. I'm never sleeping enough. Sleep disturbances could be people who are having a hard time falling asleep or staying asleep. I have some clients who share that their anxiety sometimes wakes them up at 5 o'clock in the morning and they've popped up and now here they are. And so sleep disturbance is one of those symptoms that I want everybody to be mindful of that can trigger more symptoms, right? So if you're not getting sleep, you're feeling fatigued, you're more likely, which is the second one down right here, which is irritability, intolerance, and anger. So for some people, irritability looks like just not wanting to invest, not wanting to talk about it, on edge. One of my dear friends always says that sometimes when we're irritable, we breathe fire. So it's like you're breathing fire everywhere. Nobody can do it right. The admin can't do it right. Your coworker can't do it right. The gas station attendant can't do it right. And so sometimes that irritability is one of the symptoms that I ask people to be aware of when it comes to experiencing either a lot of vicarious trauma or that layering of trauma. Another one is social isolation. So that's a hard one because we're in COVID, so nobody is socializing. But it usually is coupled with social isolation and a loss of enjoyment in activities. And so while you're likely already isolating, so this could be avoiding phone calls, I'm not answering text messages back and forth. I used to go on a walk with a friend, and now I don't even want to go on a walk because I don't know what I would say. So it's a loss of enjoyment in activities that you used to like, plus some social isolation. So we want to be mindful that social isolation is going to be there because of COVID, but we're also looking at, are people reaching out to you and you're being avoidant of that. Another one that comes up for people who've experienced trauma and are experiencing mental health symptoms is a loss of objectivity and rationale. So oftentimes what happens for people who are in a chronic stress situation like y'all are with your job is that we get a loss of objectivity, right? We have a hard time rationally responding to things that maybe 6 months ago I could respond to, and it was just an email back that said, sounds good. But now that conflict through email makes it really hard to be objective. And maybe I'm saying things that I don't mean or not congruent with the person that I want to show up with. I'm being reactive. And so some of these are things that we have to notice. And one of the great ways that I tell people to do that is 6 months ago, did you get annoyed at the email? 6 months ago, were you willing to invest in it? It doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It doesn't mean that you're not taking care of yourself. It just simply means that maybe you're experiencing one of the symptoms because of this vicarious or indirect trauma. Another symptom people experience, which is important to kind of keep our eye on, I say keep our nose on with my clients, is hypervigilance and excessive worry, right? So there is worry because we are in a double pandemic. We are in a racial uprising. Politics are thrown all over the place. Y'all work in the judicial system. We have no power and there's snow outside and nobody has a car that drives in the snow. So worry is normal, but excessive worry that keeps you up at night, you can't focus on a favorite TV show, you can't engage in a conversation, You're hypervigilant about noise, sounds that you hear, people's intention. So that hypervigilance is really important to monitor and often is a symptom of trauma. One of the things that I think is important that we remember is that for some people, some of these symptoms are things that they already have and weren't sparked by the experience of 2020. So hypervigilance lifelong can look like not when you walk in a door, never having your back to a door, right? So never having your back to a door, always knowing the exits, right? Those are things that people have maybe done their whole life, but it maybe is intensified. Hypervigilance is really common with those who experience racial trauma. So those who have experienced microaggressions, macroaggressions, racial slurs. Hypervigilance is really common, and that rationale piece can be hard because we are very aware of the people around us. And so if I've experienced a lot of microaggressions in 2020 or in my life, I'm going to be a little more hypervigilant about that. So being mindful that some people have a baseline of hypervigilance just based on their own trauma that they've experienced throughout their life. But we want to be really clear if it's bumping up even more. If you're waking up in the middle of the night because you heard a sound, if you have excessive worry about things that you can't control, family members doing things, friends doing things. Another one that pops up for a lot of people is intrusive thoughts at night and day. So what we call our automatic thoughts, thoughts that just pop in, that you can't make go away. And so intrusive thoughts, sometimes I've heard clients share, like, I'll be driving on a highway and the intrusive thought will pop in of like, what if I just steered this way? Those are intrusive thoughts, and those are one of the symptoms that come up when somebody has experienced trauma. It could be worry that's intrusive thoughts and pop up, like I'm going to lose my job, my partner is going to leave me, things that really aren't based in rationale. And then the last one is an elevated mood or high distress. So I always ask clients to rank their mood. On a day-to-day, I wake up at a 4. I go to work, I'm at a 6. 10 is my threshold, but I interact with a coworker and I'm at an 8. Can I bring that number back down? Can I calm my own distress in my body and in my mind? And can I bring it back down? If I'm having a hard time bringing my mood back down and I'm staying elevated for the duration of the day, that can also be one of the symptoms of trauma. And so being aware of that. So building resiliency. So let's say you're like, I've experienced some of these things of 2020. I'm actually having a hard time. I'm knocking 4 out of those 10. I have high stress, my mood is elevated, I've lost objectivity, I'm struggling to be rational, I'm fatigued all the time, and I'm waking up at 4 a.m. So if you're noticing that that's what's happening, we have to build some resiliency. So one of the things that I tell people is that building resiliency through coping skills doesn't mean that the feeling goes away. So building resiliency means to invest in one's own conscious efforts to resolve personal and interpersonal problems in order to master, sometimes, minimize, or tolerate unwanted emotions. So when we're talking about resiliency and coping skills, one of the things that happen, people come into my office, they say, well, I'm still really anxious. I'm anxious all day. I'm worried all day. Nothing makes it feel better. One of the things that I like to remind people is that resiliency and coping skills makes you tolerate unwanted emotion. It doesn't make them go away. Emotions are a part of life. They're a part of experiencing that we have to have. And so coping skills and resiliency doesn't make anything go away. It doesn't make the anxiety or the depression or the sadness or the fear dissipate. It just simply makes it tolerable so that you can continue on with your life. And so I always ask people when we're talking about coping skills is to give themselves some grace. We live in a culture that's really black and white, all or nothing, which means I did the skill, I journaled, so I should feel better. I went for the walk, so I should feel better. I said how I felt, so I should feel better. And the reality is that sometimes it doesn't make you feel better for this time, but it may make you feel better for next time. And better is relative. So if we're using that scale, right, if 9 is my high anxiety and I can just get it to an 8 or a 7 by using a skill, I'm better off than if I stayed at an 8, my kiddo comes home and crayons on the wall, and now I'm at a 10, right? So it's simply about getting your emotions to a place that's tolerable. And so when we're looking at building resiliency, I have a little formula that I use for everybody. So the first one is I've encountered something I don't like. I have an unwanted emotion, and I'm going to use one that's pretty typical. I had a boss say, "Can you get this done?" Put something else on my plate that I wasn't planning for, and we're in the middle of a snowstorm, and I'm having a hard time already, and somebody said, will you do this, right? So the first thing I need to do is, when I'm building resiliency and using my coping skills, is name the emotion. What am I feeling? I got the email. It says, you have 4 things to do. What's my immediate feeling? Oftentimes people are like, well, angry. Anger is a secondary emotion. And so I use this handy dandy feelings wheel. I hope you all can see it. I'm not positive if you can't. But a feelings wheel is simply all different types of feelings that you could be experiencing. So we have things from eager to free to joyful to indulgent. I feel violated. I feel bewildered. I feel overwhelmed. And so what it does is it takes an emotion you're feeling in the middle of the wheel, and it says anger. I'm angry at the email. And I ask people to go out with their emotions. Okay, so what's underneath your anger? Well, I'm feeling critical. I'm feeling let down. I'm feeling disrespected. And maybe I'm feeling jealous. Okay, identify your feelings. If you ever think you just have one, you should look at your feelings list. Feelings, you are allowed to have 5 at once, as many as you want at once. Anger, fear, surprised, happy, sad, those ones in the middle, those are primary emotions. And as you get out towards the edges, they define them more. And so I always like to ask my clients, I need 1 in the center, 1 in the middle, and 2 on the edges, so that we can really dive into what you're feeling. Once you've determined what you're feeling, the next part is, how do I cope? So I name my emotion. I'm feeling angry, but I'm also feeling disillusioned. I'm also feeling let down and critiqued. Okay, those are my 3 feelings. Now I need to decide, is this a problem solving or is this emotional based? Which coping skill do I need to use? So a problem solving coping skill is different from an emotional based coping skill. So a problem solving coping skill is simply just when you need to change the situation and remove the stressor. So if we're talking about work, you could either use it as a problem solving. So maybe I need to email my boss back and problem solve. Can somebody else jump in on this? Could I start it next week? That's the problem solving. Remove the stressor. The other coping skill I need to decide if I want to use is my emotional based coping skill. Oftentimes I can remove the stressor, which is this one work project, but it doesn't make the feelings go away. I'm still feeling unseen. I'm still feeling angry. So I need an emotional based coping skill. If I'm feeling unseen, what is the thing that makes me feel seen? If I'm feeling hurt, what is the thing that makes me feel whole? And this is when we pop into our bag of coping skills, right? So I need to decide, is it a problem solving issue where I just need to solve the problem with my boss? Or do I have emotions that I need to sit in and feel them? Oftentimes, it's this one, unfortunately. I would like to say it's usually this one, but it's not. Usually it's the feelings, because the feelings are going to come up the next time somebody asks you to do something. So I've named my emotions. I've decided that it's emotional based, so I need to take action. My plan is to use my coping skills. I'm going to utilize my skills to tolerate my emotion. Square breathing. I don't know if anybody has ever heard of that, but it's a simple 4 breaths in, hold, 4 breaths out, or 4 seconds out, hold. And I focus on my square, just back and forth. I tell people to do that at least 10 times. The next one that some people can utilize for coping skills, I don't know if you all have ever heard of tapping. So tapping is about sensory, and it's an EFT, which is an emotional focus technique. And you can tap for some clients, they tap at the inside of their arm, of their wrist. You can do up here. Some people do the inside here. And it's counting your taps, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Square breathing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All you're trying to do is just calm yourself down, right? Lower your breathing, calm yourself down. Next one you can do is a distraction. Some of my clients, it's like, I don't want to tap. I don't want to feel it. I don't want to do square breathing. I'm going to distract myself. Get up and move. Go somewhere. Go grab yourself some lunch. Call a friend to talk about it. You can do journaling, opposite action. So if you ever feel eager to do something that maybe isn't congruent with who you are or how you want to show up, do the opposite thing. I'm going to send the email. I want to send the email. I'm going to shut my computer. Hide your phone from you. Emotional awareness. So having insight to why you're feeling that way. I always like to ask clients, how is this feeling familiar? Where else do you remember having this feeling? And oftentimes, the anger that I'm experiencing today has been the anger I experienced a month ago and 2 years ago, and it's more of a common feeling. Community, reach out to your people. Context, externalize. Sometimes it's important that we remember and we put things into context and we externalize them to not be about us, but to be about other people, right? So it's not about me and my coworker thinks that I can just do it because I have all this free time. Maybe they're overwhelmed and they're struggling and they're asking for help. Play the tape out and self-compassion. So playing the tape out is, I always ask my clients to play the tape out for 24 hours. Boss emails me and says, I need you to pick up these things. I'm angry. I've used my coping skills, still upset, not going away. Play the tape out. Read the email to yourself and play it out. So let's say I send the email that I'm not going to do it. Then what happens? Well, then they get angry. And then what happens? Well, then I have to have a talk. Then what happens? Keep going. And then I'm off work. And then what happens? Do I think about it? Do I have to talk to my partner about it? If you play the tape out and see all the consequences, you're aware that if you decide to act in a way that maybe isn't congruent for who you are, that you've already played out the circumstances. So playing the tape out, and just don't play it out to sending the email, play it out to what the next day is going to be at work. What is it going to be like that evening? Are you going to think about it that evening? So just play it all the way out. And then you get to make your decision. And then the next part is that you share. You tell somebody. Emotional resiliency refers to one's ability to adapt to a situation that creates unwanted emotions. So again, we're building resiliency to adapt and to tolerate, not to make unwanted emotions go away. We don't say good or bad emotions, we just say unwanted and wanted. So some things that we can do to be more resilient. 1, have insight. Insight is important. Emotional awareness and insight to how you show up in the world and how other people see you is important. Being adaptable and flexible. Oftentimes for my clients who are struggling with anxiety, in the moment, it is often because they have a hard time being flexible. They had a vision of the way it was going to go, and I can understand that completely, and I have to be adaptable and flexible. So one of my supervisors always told me, can you pivot? Can you pivot to the next thing? And the next thing may be some self-care. It could be sending an email. It could be talking to a friend. But you got to be flexible and adaptable to be resilient. Problem solving. So to know what your skills are, right? So boss emails you and says, you have this extra work, I need you to do this. Problem solving. Do I need to talk about it? Do I not need to talk about it? Is it just easier if I do it and then I follow up at the next meeting? Problem solving for you so that you don't see it as a problem that increases your anxiety is important. Acceptance and willingness, having some patience, and communication. I always tell people that you need to pick one of these to work on a month, just one. Like maybe I struggle with being flexible. I have a plan of the way it's going to be, and I have a hard time seeing out of that. So I'm going to be accountable to my community. I'm going to communicate with my friends, with my coworker that I'm working on my flexibility, and I'm going to challenge myself to do it. Building resiliency isn't only about the moment, it's about having the insight to make the changes so that you're more resilient next time. And that could be working on your acceptance, your willingness, patience. I think it's picking one of those that you want to work on and not working on all of them at once. So if you're like, I need to work on adaptability, flexibility, and willingness, pick the easy one. Pick willingness first, and then we can work on the other ones. But oftentimes we need to give ourselves grace when we're trying to build resiliency. Okay, next thing we got is consistent self-care builds resiliency. Self-care is not bubble baths and chocolate strawberries. That's Valentine's Day. That's not self-care. Self-care can be eating a nutritious meal. It could be having a sweet because you want a sweet. It also can be taking a long bath or a shower because I feel like I need some downtime. But oftentimes we've turned to self-care into like indulgence, and we really need to be mindful of what self-care is. And I have this diagram because I think it's so helpful and a reminder for me and all of my clients. Self-care is asking for help when you need it. It's spending time alone when you can. That's relative right now. Putting yourself first, asking somebody what you need. Like, I need better clarification on that. It's setting boundaries, setting time boundaries at work. It's setting boundaries with loved ones. It's setting boundaries with family members. It's staying home when you want to stay home and not go to the birthday parade because you just don't want to. That's okay. It's forgiving yourself when you messed up at something and you're feeling really guilty about it. It's taking a break and a step back when you need to. But more than anything, self-care is saying no when you want to say no. It's saying, I can't do that. I don't have the bandwidth for that today. Self-care is about you taking care of you. If a bubble bath is how you want to have your downtime, great. But it also could look like hiding in your car and listening to a podcast for 10 minutes because that's what you want to do. It can look like calling a friend because you want to talk to them. It could look like going for a walk. Self-care is not indulging. Self-care is taking care of you. And so sometimes it's important that we remember that if we can't take care of ourselves and we have a hard time saying no, and I have a hard time asking for help and setting boundaries, I can use my community to help me do that. So I can use a coworker, a friend, a spouse. But taking care of you and promoting self-care is about making sure that you're giving yourself the time and attention. So, prioritizing your mental health. You are the most important person to you and to your family. So, you need to build community. You need people. You need friends. You need acquaintances. I can understand that right now because of social isolation, because of COVID, it's really hard. There's also a dynamic that's really challenging right now because of our social uprising. We are in a social and race uprising that is happening, and it's uncomfortable for a lot of people. It's uncomfortable because they don't know what to say. They don't know where people stand. They don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. So it's important that you have people that you can talk those things through with. You all have a very stressful job. Your job is stressful. I'm sure home life is stressful. Now we have snow and that's stressful. So having a community where you can just vent and just say something because you need an outlet. Reaching out to friends and family, finding an outlet, increasing your movement. And I'm not telling you to start running, and I'm not telling you to buy a Peloton. I'm just telling you to walk from the kitchen to the living room, or to walk out to the mailbox. To start small so that you can have some movement. Being open to change, understanding that our world is changing, how we see each other is changing, people's experiences of how they interact with one another is changing. And I need to be open to other people changing. This is a time where people are changing their world, how they see the world. And we all need to be open to change. And when we get really stuck in what we call closed thinking or confined thinking, which is like, this is the way, I only want to talk to friends about this. I don't want to talk about my relationship. I don't want to talk about work. I don't want to talk about kids. We have to be open to sharing with people in a different way. We have to be consistent and vulnerable. Unfortunately, the only way to build resiliency is to be vulnerable, is to let people know that you're struggling, or to offer support if you see that they're struggling. Being consistent in how you're showing up is important, but ultimately being vulnerable is the only way that you can really build resiliency.
And then, Ms. Redeau, yeah. we have a question.
Yeah.
The question is, how can building resiliency to cope, adapt, or tolerate be beneficial to the individual dealing with the issue or actions of microaggressions or implicit bias they are experiencing?
Good question.
Can this be helpful and safe for the individual dealing with these types of issues? That's a question in the box.
Okay. So the hard part when dealing with racism, we'll just call it what it is, racism, microaggressions, macroaggressions. I guess it doesn't have to do with race. The hard part is that the burden often is on us, the recipient of the microaggression or macroaggression, to cope. And that is not fair. It's not fair that the burden is on me, that somebody says something racist to me at the grocery store, that I have to cope, or that I've experienced something in the workplace because of my race and that I have to cope. The hard part is that burden is put on us. And so why I say to have an outlet is to have another person so I can call, which I do have other therapist friends where I'm like, you won't believe what just happened. You won't believe what they said to me. And having somebody to talk to about it, to validate you, I think where we fall into is that the person who does the harm to I'll use me as an example, to me, I get to decide if I want to communicate that. You don't have to communicate if you don't want to. You don't have to say something if you don't want to. If it feels safe to say something, then you can. But I think it's important to acknowledge that when it comes to micro and macroaggressions, the biggest injustice of it all is that I have to feel it and the person who did it doesn't feel anything. And so having people who know what it's like to feel that, and that person gets to go on with their day. So I'm hoping that I answered that question. A minute, can you this healthy, safe for individuals dealing with these types of issues? And I think when the term is healthy, that I want to point out is that everybody has a different interpretation of what's healthy for them. For me, what's healthy is talking about it. Also, I've learned through time that when it feels safe to say something, but it's also healthy for me to give my feedback and walk away. And so I think that it's important through these moments that you determine what's healthy for you. Nobody else gets to decide that. If you don't want to say anything, you don't have to. I've also had coworkers, or I've gone to coworkers and said, this happened to me and I don't feel safe saying something. And I've had coworkers be like, well, I'm going to say something. And so it's also knowing that for the person who's experiencing the micro or macroaggression, having people around you to process that with is important. And you get to determine what's healthy. Okay, I saw a yes, thank you. And this kind of leads us into the next part, which is to get a therapist. Everybody needs a therapist. If you don't have a therapist, you need a therapist. You need to either get in a therapist, you need to get in a group therapy, you need to get in a community group, but you need other people to talk to. I can understand that life is stressful, and where would you even do therapy? Sometimes I have clients who are in their car in between dropping a kid off at daycare or their co-parent's house. I've had people with their toddlers. I've had teenagers in a car with headphones while the mom is in the front seat and the teenagers have headphones on the back, and I'm just placed right there. Getting somebody to talk to is important. Somebody who doesn't have a buy-in and can just validate your experiences. Therapy doesn't always have to be what we traditionally learned, which is not how it is anymore, right? We learn that you lay on a couch, you have a person, they tell you all your feelings, and then you get some homework. It doesn't have to be that. It can be somebody you check in with monthly. It can be a group that you attend, but you need people. If you don't have a therapist, I have some resources for you. So number one, everybody should have a therapist on retainer, just like you always hear you should have a lawyer on retainer, right? Have a therapist. Contact your EAP, contact your insurance. Utilize Psychology Today. You can go in, click your insurance, what you like, you get to see pictures. That's amazing. Therapy Den. Therapy Den is also a great resource. Not only do they have therapists on there, but they also have articles that you can read in community outreach. There is a website called Therapy for Black Girls, which is designated for Black women who want to find a therapist who is a Black woman. And then there's also support groups out there. So maybe a support group for anxiety, a support group for depression. There is it's called a Centered Women of Color support group for those who are, I think she delineated those who are lawyers who want a support. Having support is important. Having somebody to talk to about what you are uniquely experiencing being in the judicial system is important. Another community support, I always tell people that if therapy isn't your thing and you're not willing to do it, then let's change. Let's be mindful of the things that you're absorbing. Let's be aware and change what you're bringing into you. I call it bringing into your spirit. Maybe it's changing some things on social media. You need to change who you follow on social media. I put some great resources for social media that clients have shared with me that they found really beneficial. There's women like Tabitha Brown. She's amazing. If you ever just want a very kind woman to talk to you and talk you off the ledge, Tabitha Brown is amazing. There's a Instagram called Black Boys, which is for Black boys who are meditating and want to get into meditation. There's Brene Brown. There's different podcasts. Like there's a podcast that one of my clients listens to called Humans Grow Stuff, which makes them feel really connected to the earth. There's also a new New York Times article that came out. It's called The Primal Scream and what it's depicting is moms who are in quarantine and working from home. And it literally is women calling in to do a primal scream or just to complain because they want somebody to listen to them. There's meetup groups, there's hiking meetup groups, so you can be outside. But if you take anything from this, please get community. If it's not one person who's a therapist, join a group, have a group of people that you chat with. There's so much technology today that we can stay connected. There are people who use apps like Marco Polo to stay connected. There's meeting apps, just making sure that you are staying connected. So getting a therapist, calling your EAP, calling your insurance, jumping on Therapy Den. If you feel like you don't know who to reach out to, I'm always available. I love to connect people with therapists. I'm personally full, but if you need a therapist, I always love connecting people with therapists, and I'm always willing to help people do that. And then lastly, making sure that you're reaching out for support. Your mental health is most important. If you can't keep it together, it's really hard to keep the job, family, and the friends. And so I'll end on an analogy that we use in treatment centers all the time, which is when the plane goes down and you have to put on your oxygen mask first before you can put it on your kiddos. So take care of yourself first. Your mental health is your oxygen. And that's what I have for y'all today. Do we have any questions? Oh, Roger, can you read that to me? Because it's like pixelated and I can't see it.
It says, do you mind briefly addressing how to be appropriately receptive to someone giving you feedback?
Yeah, great. Great question. Oftentimes we talk about the person giving feedback. Listen. So usually how feedback goes, it's called compassionate communication. And so I will say something like, when I saw you interact with the neighbor, when I saw you interact with my coworker, it made me feel blank. So listen for the person's feelings. How are they feeling? Reflecting their feelings back to them. Using I statements, acknowledging that you heard them. I can hear what you're saying. It sounds like you're feeling blank. Is that correct? It's having a dialogue that's out of here and in here. Oftentimes when we talk to convince. And there's no convincing when I'm receiving feedback. So all I'm doing is listening for emotions and validating those emotions. We're not getting into a discussion about up here, which is the intellectual discussion about why they feel that way or what you could have done differently. We're just here. I can hear that. I can hear that you felt unseen. It's just validating the emotions. And oftentimes I tell people when they've received feedback to sit in it. We used to have a rule of treatment, which is that if you get feedback, you have to sit in it for 24 hours before you can respond. So sit, feel it. The other person was feeling, so it's important that you feel too. And there's probably some insight in there for you. Thanks, Tom. Good question. Any more questions in our last 5 minutes here? Things you want to know, things you just want to throw out?
All right, so Ms. Redeau, I do have a question.
Yeah.
I see that you suggested that everyone have a therapist on retainer, but given some of the symptoms that you referenced about when you're having difficulty dealing with some of those scenarios that you outlined, would there be any particular symptom that you would say that if you're experiencing this situation? I think the big one that jumped in my mind was intrusive thoughts. If there was anything that you would suggest is sort of more of an urgent situation that you deal with.
Yeah, okay, great question. So the 3 things that would be more urgent, 1, hypervigilance. So that always being on edge, always seeing if somebody is going to harm you. So hypervigilance is 1, and being mindful that hypervigilance is a symptom of racial trauma. And so if you are a BIPOC person, oftentimes you innately have hypervigilance because it's taught intergenerationally. So that probably means that you could get some support. Intrusive thoughts, absolutely. And the last one that I always tell people is the lack of objectivity. When I no longer can see something as objective and it only becomes subjective, that means that something's getting poked and something's telling me that either my trauma is popping back up, it could be depression, it could be anxiety. So it's hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts, and lack of objectivity. Those are the ones that you should be mindful of. As for looks like, yes, I will get you all a clean copy of the slides and I can send that to anybody. I'll connect with somebody to send you the resource list and the slides so that you all can have them and use them.
Yep, you can send those to me. I'll get them.
Great. Yes. And so last words, get a therapist, reach out to one. I know that it's never fun to talk to somebody about your problems, but sometimes it changes your life. So get a therapist. If you don't want one now, it could just be good to have some names in case you do get into distress. you just have the emails already and you can shoot it over to them.
All right, great. Well, thank you, Ms. Redeau. We're down to our last 2 minutes, and unless there is another question, I'm gonna on behalf of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, I want to thank you for joining us today. I think you've given a lot of us things to think about and to check in with ourselves for to help us manage not only the work that we do, but the world that we are now living in. So
yeah.
Thank you for that. And you can see all the thank yous in the chat box as well.
Well, thank you everybody for having me, and take care of yourselves and enjoy the last of the snow.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.